Humanity cut all diplomatic ties. The Galactic Council descended into panic. The chamber was already arguing when I walked in. That was nothing new. The Galactic Council had been arguing for as long as humanity had been watching it, which was 63 years, 4 months, and 11 days. I knew the exact number because my predecessor had written it on a sticky note and left it on the desk when she retired. She had added 3 words underneath the number. Those words were, not one vote. 63 years, not one vote. I was Ambassador Sarah Voss, the 7th human to hold the title and the first one who intended to make it mean something different on the way out. The chamber of the Galactic Council sat at the heart of Vela Station, a structure so large that it had its own weather systems in the lower levels. 412 species had representatives seated in the curved rows of the assembly hall. The hall itself was designed to make everyone feel small, which it achieved with brutal efficiency. The ceiling was 300 meters above the floor. The walls were carved from a single piece of asteroid stone that had been hollowed out over 2 centuries. Every seat faced the central podium, which was raised just enough that whoever stood at it felt exposed from every direction. I had stood at that podium many times before, always to deliver reports, always to answer questions I had not been permitted to ask, always to represent a species that was allowed to watch but never allowed to touch. I walked to the podium and the chamber did not quiet down. That was normal. Humans were observers. When a human spoke, the council members kept talking among themselves, the way people in a meeting keep reading their phones when someone unimportant takes the floor. I set my single sheet of paper on the podium surface. No tablet, no projection. Paper, because I wanted something physical in my hands. The document I was about to read had taken 11 months to draft. It had gone through 42 revisions. It had been reviewed by 6 legal teams, 3 historians, and 1 very tired economist named Gary Okonkwo, who had spent 4 months running projections and then handed me his final report with the expression of a man who had looked directly into the sun. Gary's report said, in precise technical language, that humanity could survive the withdrawal. It also said between the lines that the council could not. I waited. The arguments continued. I waited some more. Then I did something no human ambassador had ever done at that podium. I did not clear my throat. I did not tap the microphone. I simply stood there, still and quiet, and I waited until the silence found me. It took 4 minutes. One by one, the conversations in the chamber slowed and stopped, the way a fire goes out when there is no more air. Representatives of 412 species looked at me. I looked back. Then I read the document. By the authority granted to me by the government and people of Earth, and under the provisions of the Observer Compact, Article 19, Section 4, I hereby deliver formal notice of humanity's complete and immediate withdrawal from all diplomatic, economic, and cooperative arrangements with the Galactic Council of Aligned Worlds, effective at the timestamp of this declaration. I gave them 3 seconds. This withdrawal is unconditional, non-negotiable, and not subject to review by any council body or affiliated institution. I gave them 2 more seconds. Humanity thanks the council for 63 years of observation. That was the 11th word. I had promised myself 11 words of thanks because it felt like the right number. Not enough to sound sincere. Too many to sound like nothing. I folded the paper. I placed my observer's badge, the little silver disc that identified me as a non-voting representative of Earth, flat on the podium surface. I did not slam it. I did not make a speech. I did not look at any particular face in the crowd. I turned and walked toward the exit. The chamber erupted behind me. 400 species, all speaking at once, in 37 different primary languages and at least 100 secondary ones, produced a sound that was less like noise and more like pressure. I felt it against my back. I kept walking. Counselor Veth Brock, the senior representative of the Veth Dominion and the species that had blocked humanity's full membership application in the very first vote 63 years ago, stood up and shouted something in the trade language that every species on the council used for official communication. I understood it perfectly. It translated roughly as, "You cannot do this." I was already at the door. I could do this. We had checked. That was the thing about Article 19, Section 4. It had been written by the Council's own legal architects 2 centuries before humanity made contact with the wider galaxy. It had been designed to allow small, weak, newly contacted species to leave if the relationship became harmful. It had never been used because no species that was small and weak enough to need it had ever been bold enough to invoke it. Humanity was no longer small. We had stopped being weak some time ago. We had simply not mentioned it. The elevator doors opened. I stepped inside. Through the glass panels, I could see the chamber, still in chaos. Representatives were out of their seats. Several were moving toward communication terminals. At least 3 species ambassadors were staring at the door I had just walked through with expressions I could not fully read, but which looked something like fear. The doors closed. I rode the elevator down 40 floors to the transport level, walked across a corridor that smelled of recycled air and machine oil, and found my assistant, a young man named Paul Adler, waiting by the shuttle gate with my bag. Paul looked at me. He was 26 years old and had been working for the Ministry of Interstellar Affairs for 14 months. He had never seen anything like what had just happened, because nobody alive had ever seen anything like what had just happened. How'd it go, he asked. Fine, I said. Is the shuttle ready? Yes, good. I took my bag from him. Did you find anywhere that sells coffee on this station? Paul blinked. There is a place on level 12. We have 20 minutes before departure, I said. Let's go. We walked toward level 12. Behind us, on the floors above, the Galactic Council was discovering what it felt like when the quiet one in the room finally decides to leave. I thought about what Gary Okonkwo had said to me the night before I departed for Vela Station. We had been sitting in his office, surrounded by the paper remains of 11 months of work. He had looked at me over the top of his reading glasses and said, very quietly, Sarah, they are going to be very upset. Yes, I had said. And you are certain this is the right move. I had thought about the 63 years, the asteroids they wanted to strip, the 200 years of extraction they had approved without asking us, the observer's badge I had worn to that podium more times than I could count. Gary, I had said, I am certain that the wrong move was letting it go on this long. He had nodded slowly and gone back to his papers. I found the coffee on level 12. It was not very good. I drank it anyway, and then I boarded the shuttle home. The first panic call arrived before we cleared the station's communications range. I watched it appear on my screen, the identifier showing the direct channel of Grand Counselor Asa Rin, the most senior diplomatic figure in the Council's entire structure, a person who had never once in 63 years initiated contact with a human ambassador. I let it go to relay. We had a long flight home. I slept most of the way, and I slept well, and when I woke up there were 47 missed calls waiting for me. I made tea, looked out the viewport at the stars, and started thinking about what came next. What came next, as it turned out, was going to be considerably more interesting than anything that had come before. I got to my desk at the ministry at 0800 on a Tuesday, which was 3 days after the declaration. Paul had already sorted the incoming messages by urgency, language group, and what he diplomatically labeled tone, which was his polite way of separating the formal requests from the ones that were clearly written in a state of distress. The distressed pile was taller than the formal one. I sat down, put my coffee to the right of my keyboard, and opened the morning briefing that Gary Okonkwo had sent at 0600. Gary never slept enough. His briefings always arrived before sunrise and were always written with the calm precision of a man describing the weather rather than the economic collapse of an interstellar civilization. The subject line read, First indicators, day 3. I read it carefully. Then I read it again. Then I sat back in my chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Not because I was surprised, but because seeing numbers you expected to see still has a weight to it. The Veth Dominion's primary grain exchange had dropped 14% overnight. A single freight relay corridor that passed through neutral space near the edge of their territory had gone quiet, not because anyone had shut it down, but because the routing algorithm that managed it had been running through Earth-based servers for the past 9 years, and those servers had been quietly taken off the Council network at the moment I placed my badge on the podium. The algorithm was still running. It was just no longer visible to Council systems. Their ships were still moving. The Council just could not see them anymore. That was the thing about how humanity had built itself into the Council's infrastructure. We had never asked for recognition. We had simply found problems and solved them, and over decades, the solutions had become invisible. The way the supports of a bridge are invisible until you remove them. I need to explain something, because people who hear the story later always assume that this was some grand plan executed from the beginning, a 60-year conspiracy with a dramatic payoff. It was not that. It was something more ordinary and I think more human. We had applied for full membership 63 years ago, when humanity had barely stepped off its own doorstep. We had been ambitious, perhaps too ambitious. The Council had debated for 8 months and then voted to grant observer status, which meant we could attend, we could report, we could contribute, but we could not vote, we could not veto, and we were expected to fulfill all the obligations of a full member without any of the protections. The species that had pushed hardest against our full membership were the three that dominated the Council's core: the Veth Dominion, the Kale Mercantile Combine, and the Reth Assembly. They called themselves the Aligned Majority, and they held enough votes between them to pass or block anything they wanted. The other 409 species existed in varying states of cooperation, resentment, or resigned acceptance, depending on their history with the majority. Humanity's first ambassadors had spent 20 years trying to build bridges, form alliances, make the kind of slow democratic progress that the system theoretically allowed. It had not worked. Every attempt to bring humanity's full membership back to a vote had been quietly procedured to death. At some point, the ministry had made a decision, not a dramatic decision, not a moment of fury or revelation, just a practical, exhausted, very human decision. If the front door is locked, stop knocking on it. Look for windows. The windows, it turned out, were everywhere. While our ambassadors continued attending council sessions and filing observer reports, a separate and much quieter branch of the ministry had spent 4 decades doing something else entirely. They had been solving problems, not council problems. Not problems that required council approval or council credit, just problems that existed in the galaxy, the kind that nobody was addressing, because the council moved slowly, and the universe did not. A shipping corridor between 2 minor species was inefficient because the routing calculations were outdated. Earth's logistics teams built a better algorithm and offered it for free to any interested party. 40 species adopted it within a decade. The council's own shipping networks adopted it without realizing who had built it. A communication relay chain in the outer systems was failing because the maintenance schedule was based on old materials science. Earth's engineering teams proposed a new maintenance model and offered to manage it. 3 council infrastructure committees accepted without putting it to a full vote, because it was classified as a technical service contract rather than a diplomatic arrangement. And technical service contracts did not require full council review. A medical database that tracked outbreak patterns across 12-star systems was incomplete and therefore unreliable. Earth's data team spent 7 years filling the gaps and standardizing the format. The database became the standard reference. Every species on the council used it. Nobody read the metadata that showed who maintained it. Over 40 years, this had accumulated into something that had no formal name in the ministry's internal records, because giving it a formal name would have required someone to acknowledge what it was. Informally, Gary Okonkwo called it the quiet architecture. It was the sum of everything humanity had built into the functioning of the galaxy that did not appear on any council ledger. When I placed my badge on that podium and walked out, the quiet architecture did not disappear. It simply stopped being available to council systems. The algorithms kept running, the relays kept functioning, the databases kept updating. But the access protocols had changed, and council-registered systems could no longer query them. It was like changing the password on an account that everyone had been using for free. The morning briefing from Gary covered the first 3 days of effects. I will summarize. The Veth grain exchange had dropped because the routing disruption had added an average of 6 days to agricultural shipments from 3 of their outer farming systems. 6 days was not catastrophic by itself, but grain futures are sensitive to delays, and the delay had no explanation that council economic analysts could identify, which was making the markets more nervous than the delay itself. The Kale Mercantile Combine had lost access to a price comparison database that their traders used to calculate fair market value across 20 different trading zones. They were currently using manual calculations and older datasets, which meant their traders were working with information that was between 2 and 11 years out of date, depending on the commodity. Gary noted, in his typically understated way, that this was likely to produce some interesting outcomes in the coming weeks. The Reth Assembly had a more immediate problem. Their entire border monitoring system had been quietly integrated with an Earth-maintained sensor network over the course of 15 years. The integration had happened gradually, and nobody at the senior level of the Assembly had been briefed on how deep it went. When the council access was cut, their border monitoring did not fail. It just became significantly less accurate. They knew something had changed, but they were still trying to figure out what, because the documentation of the integration existed primarily in files that were now behind the new access protocols. I put the briefing down and picked up my coffee. Paul knocked on my open door. "The Veth ambassador is requesting an urgent meeting," he said. "So is the KL representative. And someone from the Reth Assembly's technical division has been calling since 0500. Tell them the ministry is currently reviewing all incoming diplomatic requests and will respond in order of receipt, I said. Paul wrote that down. And the council's official mediation office. They've sent a formal request for dialogue. I considered this. The council's mediation office was technically different from the council itself. It was supposed to be a neutral body. In practice, it was funded primarily by the three majority species and staffed mostly by their citizens. It had, over the years, mediated a number of disputes in ways that consistently favored the majority. Tell them, I said, that Earth is not currently a member of any body that falls under the Council's mediation jurisdiction, and therefore the mediation office has no standing to request dialogue with us. If they have a concern, they should direct it to the Council, who can then determine whether any applicable framework exists. I wish them a productive day. Paul looked at his notes. All of that? You can paraphrase. He nodded and went back to his desk. I opened the next file in my queue, which was a report from our Trade Liaison Office. It was not about the Council. It was about our existing private treaties, the ones we had signed bilaterally with 47 species over the past 3 decades, outside Council frameworks, and therefore not subject to Council nullification. Every one of those treaties was still active. Every one of those relationships was intact. We had not cut those ties. We had only cut the one that had never given us anything in return. The report showed that in the 3 days since the withdrawal, 9 of those 47 partners had already reached out to confirm their treaty status and express continued interest in the relationship. One of them, a species called the Ferenti, whose small and densely forested homeworld sat in a region technically under Reth Assembly influence, had sent a message that was brief even by interstellar communication standards. It said, "We saw what you did. We have been thinking about a similar step for some time. Is there a conversation to be had?" I read it twice. I forwarded it to the minister with a note. This one we answer personally. Gary knocked on my door at mid-morning, which was unusual because Gary communicated almost entirely by report. He was a compact man in his late 50s with reading glasses that he pushed up constantly, and the kind of calm that comes not from the absence of feeling, but from long practice at keeping feelings where they belong. He sat across from me without being invited, which meant it was serious. The Council's internal economic simulation system ran its first full model last night, he said. Our contact at the Communications Monitoring Office sent us a flag on it, and the model returned an error. Specifically, it flagged the input parameters as implausible because the projected disruption curves exceeded the threshold the system is programmed to treat as realistic. I stared at him. Their own simulation system doesn't believe its own results. Correct. Gary pushed his glasses up. The system was designed at a time when no single non-member entity was embedded deeply enough in Council infrastructure to produce disruption at this scale. It literally cannot process the numbers as real. It assumes they reflect a data error. I sat with that for a moment. 63 years of careful, quiet, unrewarded work, and the most sophisticated economic modeling system in the galaxy had looked at the consequence of our departure and decided the numbers were too large to be true. How long before they override the error and rerun, I asked. Gary's estimate was 48 to 72 hours, Gary said, referring to himself in the third person the way he always did when quoting his own projections, a habit I had long stopped questioning, at which point the results will be accurate and considerably harder to dismiss. Good, I said. Gary looked at me with the expression he used when he thought I was being too calm. Sarah, the second run is going to show numbers that will frighten a very large number of very powerful species. Yes, I said. That is rather the point. He considered that. Then he pushed his glasses up one more time, nodded, and stood to leave. Gary, I said. He paused at the door. You did good work, all of it. All 40 years of it. He looked at the floor for a moment. Then he said, the Ferenti message is interesting, I know. If they move, others will follow. That is what I am hoping, I said. He left. I turned back to my screen. The distressed messages were still there, still growing. Somewhere above the atmosphere of Earth, 100 diplomatic shuttles were trying to calculate trajectories that had not existed a week ago, toward a destination that had not existed a week ago, to have conversations that had not been possible a week ago. Paul appeared in my doorway again. Another call from the Veth ambassador, he said. They are describing it as extremely urgent. I'm sure they are, I said. Put them in the queue. I opened the Ferenti file and began to draft a reply. Not a formal diplomatic document, just a letter. Human to humans, as they say, except in this case it was human to whatever the Ferenti equivalent was, and the gap between those two things turned out to matter far less than anyone at the Council had ever wanted to admit. The work The real work was just beginning, and for the first time in 63 years, I was looking forward to it. Day 4 arrived the way mornings tend to arrive when something large has already been set in motion, with a kind of ordinary brightness that sits strangely against everything that is happening underneath it. I was at my desk before the sun was fully up, coffee at my right hand, the morning briefing open on my screen. Paul knocked twice and entered without waiting. He had adapted to the new pace faster than I expected. There was a sharpness to him now that had not been there 3 weeks ago, the look of someone who has realized they are participating in something that will be in books one day. The Veth Dominion's ambassador has arrived in Earth orbital, he said. Unannounced. No prior communication. They are requesting immediate docking clearance. I looked up from the briefing. What vessel? Personal diplomatic courier, single ship. Ambassador Rella Voss is aboard. She is a senior representative, not the same official who sent the 47 calls. I noted this. Rella Voss was not a name I recognized from council sessions, which was itself information. The council's first response diplomats were always the visible ones, the ones who sat in the front rows and made speeches. If Voss was being sent, it meant someone had decided that the visible ones were not working. Grant docking clearance, I said. Put her in conference room C on the orbital station. Tell her I will be up in 2 hours. Do not tell her I am on my way immediately. Paul nodded and left. I finished my coffee, sent a brief message to Gary that said, Voss is here, 2 words that I knew would require no further explanation, and took the shuttle up. I arrived in 1 hour and 40 minutes, which gave me 20 minutes to review the background file on Voss before entering the room. She was a career diplomat, 40 years in service, with a specialty in what the Veth categorized as resolution of complex structural disputes. She had never dealt with anything on this scale, but then, neither had anyone. I walked into conference room C, carrying nothing but a tablet and my coffee. Rella Voss was taller than I expected, with the coloring common to the northern clans of the Veth Dominion, a deep gray blue that shifted slightly in different light. She stood when I entered, which I noted, because Veth diplomats generally did not stand for human representatives. Ambassador Voss, she said in the trade language. Ambassador Voss, I replied. Please sit down. We sat across from each other. The table between us was a standard orbital station conference table, which is to say it was functional and not impressive. I had not arranged anything better, because I had decided that the setting should be exactly as neutral as it appeared. You came a long way without an appointment, I said. The usual communication channels, she said carefully, did not appear to be producing the results my government had hoped for. 47 calls in 3 days is a reasonable attempt, I agreed. She absorbed this without visible reaction. Ambassador Voss, I want to be direct with you. Please, my government is prepared to bring a full membership resolution back to the council floor. Voting rights, no extraction levies, a formal review of the asteroid quota from Resolution 7 Gamma. She paused. We are prepared to support it. I looked at her. The Veth Dominion, whose senior representative had blocked humanity's membership application 63 years ago, was offering to bring it back. That is a significant change in position, I said. The situation has changed significantly, she replied. I nodded slowly. It has. I put my tablet on the table. Ambassador Voss, let me ask you something directly. Is this offer coming because the Veth Dominion believes humanity deserves full membership? Or because the Veth Dominion has discovered how much of its daily functioning was connected to systems we control? The silence lasted about 4 seconds. In diplomatic terms, 4 seconds is a long time. Both things can be true at once, she said finally. They can, I agreed, but they lead to different conversations. I picked up my tablet again. I am not going to tell you no today, because I respect the fact that you came here personally. But I am also not going to tell you yes, because the answer to what you are proposing is not mine alone to give, and because the question has changed. She tilted her head slightly. How has the question changed? When humanity applied for full membership 63 years ago, we were asking to join the council. We wanted a seat at a table that already existed. That was the question then. I set the tablet down. The question now is different. She waited. Now the question is, what kind of arrangement best serves the species that were never given a real place at that table in the first place? Voss was quiet. I could see her processing the scope of what I had just said. I did not fill the silence. Letting silence work for you is something human diplomats learn early. Because we spent 63 years in rooms where we were not supposed to speak and had to become very patient. You are not talking about the council, she said at last. I am talking about a lot of things, I said. But not today. Today, I am simply telling you that the conversation you came here to have is not the one that is available. She stood slowly. And what conversation is available? I stood as well. Come back in 2 weeks. Bring your authorization codes for independent treaty negotiation, not council-mediated diplomacy. We will talk. She studied me for a long moment. Then she gave a single, slow nod, which in Veth formal culture means something closer to received than to agreed. It was the right response. It told me she understood the difference between what she had expected and what was actually happening. She left. I finished my coffee in the empty conference room and looked out at the curve of the earth below. Paul was waiting in the corridor. He was carrying a second tablet. While you were in there, he said, 3 more delegations requested orbital docking clearance. Which 3? The Kale Mercantile Combine, the Oru Collective, and a single-person vessel registered to a private citizen of the Reth Assembly. But our identification check shows the occupant is a senior advisor to the Reth Council of 7. I took the tablet from him. Grant clearance to the Oru and the private Reth vessel. Tell the Kale their request is under review and we will respond within 48 hours. Paul noted this. Any particular reason for the Kale delay? The Kale lead with trade. If we meet them now, they will offer us something and expect us to negotiate from their opening position. I handed the tablet back. 48 hours of waiting will remind them that we are not negotiating from a position of need. Paul nodded. He was learning quickly. The Oru Collective's representative was a small being named Issa Noth, who communicated partly through translated speech and partly through a series of low-frequency tonal signals that our ministry's translation equipment rendered as emotional context, essentially footnotes to the words that conveyed how the speaker actually felt, rather than just what they were saying. It was one of the more unusual forms of communication I had encountered, and also, once you were used to it, one of the most honest. Issa Noth arrived in Conference Room A, which was slightly nicer than Conference Room C, a small and deliberate signal. She sat down, and before I had finished arranging my things, she said, "We want to understand what you are building." The tonal translation added a context note. Curiosity, not suspicion. I liked the Oru immediately. We are not building anything yet, I said. We are creating conditions under which something can be built. The Ferenti have been in contact with you, she said. It was not a question. Several parties have been in contact with us, I said. The Ferenti sent a message 9 days before your withdrawal from the council. Another not a question. I looked at her steadily. The Oru had better information networks than most species gave them credit for, which was a pattern I was beginning to recognize across many of the council's smaller members. If that is accurate, I said, what does it tell you? It tells me, Issa Noth said, that this was planned with more care than the council is currently assuming. The tonal context note was complex, something that translated as a mix of admiration and relief. We have been hoping for a long time that someone would do something like this. We did not expect it to be humans. Why not? Because you were quiet, she said. Quiet species usually stay quiet. We were not quiet, I said. We were patient. There is a difference. She considered this. The tonal note attached to her next pause was long and resonant, and the translation system rendered it simply as, yes. We talked for 2 hours, not about treaties, not about specific terms, not about numbers or logistics. We talked about what the galaxy had been like for species that were not part of the aligned majority. We talked about the ways the council's structure rewarded size and penalized cooperation among small parties. We talked about what fair interstellar relations might look like if someone were to design them from the beginning, with no inherited assumptions. At the end of 2 hours, I walked Issa Noth back to the docking port. She stopped at the threshold and turned to me. The Ferenti are not the only ones who have been thinking about this, she said. There is a cluster of 7 species in the outer systems. They do not sit near each other in the council chambers. They have been careful not to be seen talking to each other, but they have been talking. The tonal context note was cautious but bright, like a door opening slowly on a sunny room. If someone with a plan reached out to them, they might listen. I appreciate that, I said. Do you have a plan? I looked at her steadily. I have the beginning of one. She nodded once and walked back to her ship. The Reth Assembly advisor was a human-sized being named Corvin Drest, who arrived carrying a case of documents that he spent the first 5 minutes of our meeting arranging on the table with great precision. He was methodical in a way that made me think of engineers. He looked at everything twice before touching it. I am here in a private capacity, he said carefully, once the documents were arranged. I understand, I said. I want to be very clear that nothing I say today represents the official position of the Reth Assembly. Of course, I said. He nodded. Then he looked directly at me and said, the border monitoring situation is more serious than my government has publicly acknowledged. I said nothing. I kept my expression neutral and open, which is the diplomatic equivalent of please continue. The integration with your sensor network was not approved at the senior level, he said. It was approved at the infrastructure committee level 14 years ago as a technical upgrade. No one explained to the senior council what the scope of the integration would become. He paused. No one at the senior level thought to ask. And now, I said. And now our senior officials are being told by their technical teams that the monitoring gap is significant, that remediation will take between 3 and 5 years, and that they did not know they had a dependency of this scale on a non-member species systems. He lined up one of his documents more precisely with the table edge. It is an uncomfortable conversation. I imagine it is, I said. There is a faction within the assembly that wants to treat this as a security threat, he said. There is another faction that is pointing out that a security threat implies hostile intent, and that there is no evidence Earth was anything other than a very effective service provider that has now stopped providing services. The second faction is correct, I said. Yes, he said. I am here because I agree with the second faction, and because I think the second faction's position becomes stronger if there is a clear path toward a new arrangement, one that does not go through the Council's standard processes. I looked at him. Why not the standard processes? He looked back at me with an expression that required no translation. Because the standard processes are what produced the current situation, I nodded. Then I think, I said, that you and I have something to talk about. We talked for an hour. I did not make promises. I gave him the same text I had sent the Ferenti, a copy of a draft document, 12 pages, that I described only as a framework for thinking. It had no official title. It did not need one yet. By the time I returned to my office on Earth, it was late afternoon. Paul had a fresh summary on my desk. The Kale Mercantile Combine had sent 3 more requests for an urgent meeting. The Council's mediation office had escalated its request to what it called a formal demand for dialogue, which had no legal weight since we were not under their jurisdiction, but which I suppose represented their version of raising their voice. Gary had sent a new briefing. The Council's economic simulation system had been overridden by a senior analyst who did not believe the error flag was accurate. The rerun was scheduled for the following morning. Gary estimated that by noon the day after tomorrow, the results would be in the hands of every senior counselor. He had attached a single sentence at the bottom of the briefing. The next 72 hours will determine the tone of the next decade. I read it twice, then I wrote back, agreed, get some sleep, Gary. He did not reply, which meant he was already writing another report. I looked out my office window at the Earth evening, the sky going purple and orange at the edges, the first stars appearing directly overhead. Somewhere up in that sky, the Aru representative was heading home with a 12-page draft document. Somewhere further out, in a forested system that most counselors could not have found on a map without help, a species called the Ferenti were reading a letter I had written by hand 3 days ago. And somewhere on Vela Station, 412 species were watching their economic models produce numbers they did not want to believe, and trying to understand how a species they had never fully looked at had become so deeply woven into the fabric of everything they had built. I thought about what Isanoth had said. Quiet species usually stay quiet. We had been patient. We had been thorough. We had been invisible for decades by choice, not by limitation. And now the galaxy was looking at the space where we had been, seeing the shape of everything we had quietly held together, and realizing all at once that we had not left an empty space. We had left a door. Paul appeared in my doorway one final time that evening. He looked tired but alert, the way young people look when they are tired but do not want to stop. Anything else before I go, he asked. One thing, I said. Draft a response to the Ferenti. Keep it short. Tell them yes, there is a conversation to be had, and ask them to be ready to host a small meeting in 3 weeks. Secure channel, no council relay infrastructure, he wrote it down. Attendees, use the Ferenti the Owuru. I paused. And whoever those 7 outer system species decide to send, if they decide to send anyone. Paul looked up from his notes. Are we building an alliance? I considered the word. An alliance suggested something military, something drawn up against something else. That was not what I had in mind. We are building a table, I said, a real one, with real seats. And this time, everyone at it has an equal vote. He nodded and wrote that down too. After he left, I sat in the quiet for a while. The ministry building was emptying out around me, the daytime sounds fading into the hum of the ventilation system and the distant murmur of the city outside. Tomorrow would be loud. The day after would be louder. The council's simulation results would land, and the panic that had so far been disorganized and reactive would become something more structured and therefore more creative in its attempts to pull us back. We were ready for that too. I turned off my desk lamp, picked up my bag, and walked out through the empty corridor. On my way to the exit, I passed the wall where every human ambassador's official portrait hung in chronological order, starting with the first one 63 years ago. A tired-looking woman named Grace Alderton, who had traveled to Vela Station with enormous hope and come back with an observer badge, and not much else. I stopped in front of her portrait for a moment. "We got there, Grace," I said quietly to the painted face. Then I went home. I was not supposed to be watching the Council's internal deliberation channel. I want to make that clear. The Signals Monitoring Division of Earth's Ministry of Interstellar Air Affairs is a legitimate and necessary branch of government that performs entirely lawful functions within established legal parameters. What it was doing on the morning of Day 22 was probably at the outer edge of those parameters. In practice, this meant that I had a live feed of the Council's Grand Convocation on a secondary screen in the corner of my office, and my Oru liaison, whose name was Isanoth, and who had, in the 3 weeks since her first visit, become something close to a permanent fixture in our building, was sitting across from me watching it with great attention. I had explained the concept of popcorn to her on Day 16. She had been, as I anticipated, horrified. She had also, in the way of the Oru, immediately decided to try it and was now working through her third bowl. The tonal context note she produced most frequently while eating it was one our translation system had eventually settled on rendering as "this is unreasonable and I want more." The Grand Convocation was, in theory, a display of council unity. In practice, on this particular morning, it was something else entirely. The council chamber, the same chamber I had walked out of 22 days ago, was divided into 3 visible factions, which was remarkable because the council's seating arrangements were designed specifically to prevent visible factionalization. Councilors were assigned seats by region, not by alliance, so that physical proximity would encourage cross-species dialogue rather than block formation. The fact that 3 distinct groupings had formed anyway, with visible gaps between them like tectonic plates pulling apart, told you something about the state of things. The faction seated to the left of center, which I had come to think of as the reaction group, was led by the Veth Dominion's senior representatives, and included most of the aligned majority's traditional supporters. Their position, as best I could translate from the live feed, was that humanity's withdrawal was an act of deliberate economic interference and should be treated as such. The faction in the center was what I thought of as the realists. They had been reading Gary's reports, or reports very like Gary's, and they understood that describing humanity's withdrawal as an attack was technically accurate in the way that describing a person leaving a party as ruining the party was technically accurate. Yes, the party was disrupted, but the person who left was not obligated to stay. The right side faction was the smallest, and they were the most interesting. They were the ones who had spent the past 3 weeks reading the same documentation that Corvin Drest had been quietly distributing through back channels, the documentation that described, in precise and uncomfortable detail, how many of the Council's systems were dependent on infrastructure that humanity had built, and that the Council had never formally acknowledged or compensated. Isanoth watched the feed with the focused attention of someone who has long been underestimated in rooms like that one. Her tonal context was layered and complex. The translation system was producing things like recognition, and something it could only render as the particular satisfaction of a suspicion confirmed. The right faction is going to propose something significant, she said. They already have, I said. Internally, 3 days ago, we heard about it yesterday. She looked at me. What did they propose? I told her. The proposal, drafted by a coalition of 9 smaller council species, with the quiet support of the right side bloc, was the most extraordinary document the council had produced in 40 years. It proposed offering humanity full membership retroactively, voting rights effective immediately, exemption from all extraction levies permanently, and a formal back payment calculated at standard interstellar rates, covering 63 years of observer fees that humanity had paid while performing full member functions without full member rights. The back payment figure, when Gary's team ran it, came to a number with 11 digits. I had forwarded it to the ministry with one word: late. The minister had called me immediately. He was a careful, methodical man named Owen Briggs, who had been in government for 30 years, and was not given to strong expressions of feeling. His response to the proposal was, in its entirety, "They've lost their minds." "No," I had said. "They've found their calculators." On screen, the Grand Convocation was reaching the part where the three factions had to officially present their positions. The Veth Dominion's senior speaker stood at the central podium and delivered a speech that lasted 23 minutes, and was, structurally, a work of political art. He never once mentioned that the Veth Dominion's grainage exchange had now dropped 21%. He never acknowledged that 3 of the Dominion's key shipping routes were operating at reduced efficiency because the routing systems that had been taken off Council access were still running perfectly well, just not for them. He spoke about principle, sovereignty, and the integrity of the Council's legal framework, in a voice that was calm and measured and gave away nothing of the panic underneath. Isanoth's tonal context note during this speech was brief and needed no translation. He is frightened. The center faction speaker went next and delivered a much shorter address that was essentially a plea for strategic pragmatism. She used the phrase unprecedented situation 4 times, which, in Council diplomatic language, meant something like, we have no idea what we are doing, and we would very much like someone to tell us. Then the right side faction speaker stood. He was a Ferenti observer, one of a handful of Ferenti who still maintained Council credentials, and he was reading from a document. The proposal before this body, he said, in a voice that carried clearly through the chamber, acknowledges that the current situation is the result of structural failures within the Council that predate humanity's withdrawal by several decades. The offer of retroactive full membership is an attempt to correct those failures. He paused. The chamber was quieter than I had ever seen it. However, he continued, we have been informed, through appropriate channels, that the question has changed. The Veth senior speaker stood up immediately. What does that mean? Who informed you? Through what channels? The Ferenti observer looked at him with the calm patience of a species that had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. The same channels, he said, that have always been available to any member who chose to use them, the ones that go around this chamber rather than through it. The Veth speaker sat down slowly. I turned off the feed. I had seen enough of that particular scene to understand where it was going. The Council would debate. They would table proposals. They would form a committee, probably 2 committees, and the committees would produce recommendations that would go back to the full chamber for further debate. It was what the Council did. It was what the Council had always done. The architecture of the institution was designed to slow things down, to require consensus from 400 species before anything changed, which meant that in practice, the 3 dominant species could maintain any status quo they chose for as long as they chose, simply by preventing the consensus from forming. Issa Noth set down her bowl of popcorn. They are going to form a committee, she said. Yes, I said. It will take months. Probably closer to a year, I said, for the first committee. The second committee will take longer. She was quiet for a moment, and while they are in committee, I smiled. While they are in committee, I said, we have a meeting to prepare for. The meeting she was referring to had been 3 weeks in the making and had gone through several rounds of quiet, careful negotiation that had taken place entirely outside Council communication channels. The attendees had been chosen not by position or by the size of their territory, but by a single criterion. They had all, at some point in the past decade, asked a version of the same question. Is there another way? I opened the file on my screen, 14 species, 12 independent worlds, Earth. The founding meeting of what had no official name yet, and which Paul had taken to calling the New Table in his notes, was scheduled to take place in 18 days on a station that belonged to the Ferenti, and that sat technically in a region of space that the Council's jurisdiction maps described as undefined due to ongoing boundary review. It had been an ongoing boundary review for 37 years. Nobody had ever resolved it because nobody had ever needed to. And in the meantime, the Ferenti had built a station there that the Council had never formally acknowledged. It was, in other words, a perfectly neutral location. Gary knocked on my doorframe. He was holding a printed document, which was unusual because Gary sent everything digitally. The fact that he had printed something meant he wanted to hand it to me directly, which meant it was something he wanted to discuss in person. He came in, sat down, and put the document on my desk. I read it. It was a second proposal from the Council, separate from the full membership offer. This one had not come through official channels. It had come through a private intermediary, a retired KL diplomat, who had a personal relationship with one of our ministry's senior staff and who had been used as an informal back channel for smaller matters in the past. The proposal was simple, and in its simplicity, more alarming than anything the Council had put forward officially. It offered Earth not membership in the Council, but control of the Council's logistics infrastructure, a formal contract. Earth's systems would be recognized as the official backbone of Council trade and communication routing. In exchange, Earth would receive a seat on a new Infrastructure Oversight Committee that would report directly to the Grand Council. No voting rights in the main chamber. No removal of the extraction levies. No back payment. But recognition. Official, formal, documented recognition of the architecture we had built. I read it twice. Then I looked at Gary. They want to make us official, I said. They want to make you employed, he said. There is a difference. I understood exactly what he meant. What the council was proposing was not partnership. It was not equality. It was a formalization of the arrangement that had existed for 40 years, except this time with paperwork. Instead of an invisible architecture that humanity maintained and received nothing for, there would be a visible architecture that humanity maintained and received a seat on a committee that had no votes for. They were offering to change the label without changing the contents. Who drafted this? I asked. We believe it originated with the Kale Mercantile Combine, Gary said, with input from the VETH. It has not been formally voted on by the council. It was sent through the back channel, precisely because they are not sure it would pass a formal vote. Because the right side faction would oppose it. Correct. Because the right side faction has been speaking to the Ferenti Observer, and the Ferenti Observer has been speaking to others. Gary paused. The proposal was sent now because someone in the council leadership has realized that the window for this kind of offer is closing. I put the document down. They are watching the same thing we are watching. They can count the attendees for the new table, Gary said. Not the actual names, I don't think, but the general number. And they know that once the table is built, the offer to become their logistics contractor becomes considerably less attractive. I nodded. Correct answer. Gary looked at me steadily. What is the response? I thought about it for exactly as long as it deserved, which was not very long. Tell the intermediary that we received the communication and that we are not in a position to engage with proposals that have not been formally approved by the council's full chamber. If they would like to bring it to a vote, we will review it at that time. I picked up the document and put it in the drawer. We both know it will never come to a vote. Gary nodded. He stood to leave. At the door, he paused in the way he did when he had something further to say and was deciding how to say it. Sarah, the informal back channel that delivered this message, the retired Kale diplomat. What about her? She asked, when she delivered it, whether there would be a place at the new table for older species who have spent their careers working within the council system and who are no longer sure the system is worth preserving. I looked at him carefully. She asked personally? Personally, Gary said. Off the record. I was quiet for a moment. Then, tell her the answer is in Article 7. If she doesn't have a copy, send her one. Gary allowed himself a small smile, which was as close as he got to showing genuine satisfaction. I already sent it, he said, last night. He left. I turned back to my screen. 18 days. The council was in committee. The council was sending back-channel proposals. The council was doing what the council had always done, which was to treat every crisis as a negotiation to be managed, rather than a failure to be understood. Meanwhile, 14 species, and 12 independent worlds, and one very tired human diplomat were building something that had never existed before. A table where the smallest voice had the same weight as the largest one, where the entry requirement was not military power or economic size, but simply the willingness to be honest about what fair interstellar cooperation actually meant. I pulled up the founding charter document on my screen. It was 47 pages. I had written the first draft myself, and it had gone through 12 revisions from the other attending species legal teams. Every revision had made it better, not because anyone was trying to accumulate advantages, but because everyone at the draft table had spent enough time at the old table to know exactly what not to do. I opened Article 7 and read it again. Not because I needed to, but because I liked the way it was written. Any species in a period of transition between institutional memberships may apply for provisional status within this compact, provided they demonstrate a commitment to its founding principles and accept the full rights and responsibilities of provisional membership during the transition period. No provisional member shall be denied a voice in proceedings relevant to their transition. It was 11 lines. It had taken 4 months to draft and 9 revisions to reach its final form. I thought about Grace Alderton's portrait on the wall downstairs. I thought about 63 years of patient, quiet, invisible work. I thought about a council chamber full of 400 species who had looked at the numbers their own simulation system had returned and still, somehow, expected the solution to be a committee. And then I closed the document, picked up my coffee, and got back to work. There was a table to finish building. On day 60, she arrived without warning. I was in the middle of a working lunch with Paul and two members of the Ferentide Advance team when the front desk called up to say that a VETH official had arrived at the Ministry building on a civilian transit pass. No diplomatic credentials, no prior communication, no security detail. Paul looked at me. I looked at him. Which VETH official? I asked. The answer came back in 30 seconds. Her name was Councillor Marin Vash. She was 71 years old. She had served on the council's inner chamber for 38 years. She was not the VETH Dominion's ambassador. She was not a spokesperson. She was one of the oldest and most senior members of the council's core governing structure, the equivalent of someone who had been in the deepest room of a very important building for most of their life. She had traveled here on a civilian transit pass. I told them to bring her to the Geology Conference Hotel, which was what we still called the building we had converted into a makeshift diplomatic facility in the first frantic weeks. It still had the old signage in places. There was a framed map of tectonic plate boundaries in the hallway outside what was now Meeting Room 4. I had left it there on purpose. It seemed appropriate. I arrived 5 minutes after she did. She was sitting at the small table, both hands flat on its surface, looking at the tectonic plate map through the glass panel in the door. When I came in, she looked at me with the eyes of someone who had spent a long time getting to a room and was not sure what to say now that they were there. She was smaller than I had expected. Councillor Marin Vash of the VETH Dominion, one of the most powerful figures in the Galactic Council, was a small old individual sitting alone in a room that smelled faintly of the coffee someone had left in the corner. Ambassador Voss, she said, in the trade language, but slowly the way someone speaks when they are choosing every word. Councillor Vash, I said. I sat across from her. Can I get you something? Water or no, she said. Thank you. She looked at the table surface. I am not here officially. I understand. I want to make sure you understand what that means, she said. It means I have no authority to make offers or accept terms. It means I did not tell my government I was coming here. It means that if you wish to treat this as an informal conversation with no diplomatic weight, you are entitled to do so. I understand, I said again. Why did you come? She was quiet for a moment. In the silence, I could hear the building around us, the soft sounds of people moving through corridors, the distant noise of an orbital shuttle from somewhere above. I have been in the council's inner chamber for 38 years, she said at last. I have watched it make decisions that I agreed with, and decisions that I did not. I have voted for things that I was not proud of, and against things that I should have supported. She looked up at me. I voted against humanity's full membership in the original session. 63 years ago, I held her gaze. I know. I voted against it because the Dominion's position was against it, and because I was 33 years old and 3 years into my council career, and because I believed that the council's stability was more important than any single membership question. She paused. I've had a long time to think about that vote. What have you concluded? I asked. I have concluded, she said carefully, that stability maintained by exclusion is not stability. It is a form of pressure that builds until something breaks. She looked down at her hands. Something broke. I did not say anything. I waited. The council is not going to survive another decade, she said. The words were quiet and precise, like something she had been practicing, not in its current form. The three majority species have too many competing interests, and not enough external pressure to force them to cooperate. The smaller members are losing confidence. The back-channel communications that are happening outside formal council processes are, she paused, considerable. I am aware, I said. I am sure you are. Something in her voice shifted, not warmer exactly, but more direct. Ambassador Voss, I did not come here to tell you the council is failing. You know that better than I do. I came here because I have been in that institution for 38 years, and I know where everything is buried, and I know which individuals are worth speaking to and which ones are not, and I know the specific legal mechanisms that can be used to formalize a transition from one institutional structure to another in a way that minimizes disruption to the species who depend on what the council provides. I looked at her. You want to help build the new table? She met my eyes. I want to ensure that when the old table falls, as many species as possible land somewhere safe. The room was quiet for a moment. Councillor Vash, I said, are you telling me you intend to leave the council? I am telling you, she said, that I am 71 years old, and I have spent 38 years in a room where the wrong people had all the power, and I am tired of it. I am telling you that if your founding charter has an Article 7, as I have been given to understand it does, I would like to know what it says. I reached into my bag and placed a copy of the charter on the table between us. I did not open it. I did not point to Article 7. I simply placed it there and let her take it. She picked it up with both hands, the way people handle things they know are important. She opened it. She read slowly. I watched her face as she read Article 7. I watched the exact moment when she reached the line that said no provisional member shall be denied a voice in proceedings relevant to their transition. She did not say anything. She read it again. Then she put the charter down and looked at me, and for the first time since she had walked into the room, the weight in her expression shifted into something else. Not relief exactly. Something more careful than relief. Something that looked like the first step of a long journey that someone has finally decided to take. This is not the council, she said. No, I said. It is not. It will face challenges the council never faced, she said. New institutions always do. The smaller species will find it harder than they expect to maintain equal standing when economic pressures favor the larger ones. The legal frameworks will need to evolve faster than any committee can manage. There will be crises that nobody has planned for. Yes, I said. All of that is true, and you intend to proceed anyway. Yes, I said. She looked at the charter again. Why? I thought about how to answer that. Not because I did not know the answer, but because the honest answer was not particularly diplomatic. And Councillor Vash, with 38 years in the inner chamber, deserved honesty more than diplomacy. Because the alternative, I said, is 63 more years of waiting for a system that is not going to change, while the species that need it to change most continue to pay the price for its failures. I leaned her forward slightly. We are not proceeding because we think it will be easy. We are proceeding because it needs to exist, and because we are the ones in the position to build it. She was quiet. Then she said, "What do you need from me?" I looked at her steadily. Right now, nothing. Go home. Read the charter. Read all 47 pages, not just Article 7. Come back in 10 days with any questions you have. I paused. And if, after 10 days, you still want to contribute, we will find a place for what you know. She nodded once. She stood slowly and picked up the charter. I will read it tonight, she said. Good, I said. I walked her back to the corridor. At the door, she stopped and turned. Ambassador Voss. The proposal the Kale sent through the back channel. The infrastructure contract. What about it? It was not the Kale's idea, she said. It was mine. I drafted it 3 weeks ago and suggested it to them as a framework. She looked at me with the steadiness of someone stating a fact that costs something to say. I thought it was the best the council could offer. I thought it might be enough. I held her gaze. And now? And now I have read Article 7, she said, and I understand that I was thinking about what the council could offer rather than what the situation actually required. She looked down for a moment. I was still inside the building when I drafted it. I was still thinking like someone inside the building. You are outside it now, I said. She considered that. Yes, she said, I suppose I am. She left. I stood in the corridor for a moment, listening to the building around me, the movement and hum of a place that had, over 60 days, transformed from a ministry facility into something that was harder to name, and more important than anything the ministry had built before. The founding summit of the Compact of Aligned Worlds, which was the name the charter had been given in its final revision, was 3 days away. 14 species, 12 independent worlds, and humanity, not as a leader. Not as the species that had built the quiet architecture and cut the ties and triggered the panic. Just as a full and equal founding member, with 1 vote and a seat at the table like everyone else. I had written the opening address myself, and then revised it 11 times, and then, the night before I was due to submit the final version, I had deleted it entirely and started again. The final version was short. It was by design 11 words long, because some things deserved to be circular. When I walked into the summit hall 3 days later, the chamber was smaller than the council's, deliberately so. The seats were arranged in a circle rather than tiered rows facing a single podium, which meant that no one person was at the center and no one seat was higher than another. The ceiling was low enough to feel human, which several of the attending species had pointed out was probably not the right word, and which we had agreed to simply call inhabited. 14 species, 12 independent worlds. Paul was at the back of the room with a tablet, and the expression of someone who has been awake for too long and does not care. Gary was seated to my left, his reading glasses in place, his reports filed, his 40 years of quiet architectural work finally and formally acknowledged in the Charter's preamble, which named no individuals but described the work in terms precise enough that anyone who had been part of it would recognize themselves. I walked to the center of the circle, which was not a podium but simply an open space on the floor, and I turned so that I could see every seat. Welcome, I said. And then I said the other 10 words. The chamber laughed. Not because it was funny, exactly, but because it was the right note. And sometimes the right note produces laughter. And sometimes laughter is the appropriate response to 63 years of something finally becoming something else. We spent 4 days in that room. We argued about 9 of the 47 articles. We revised 3 of them. We voted on everything, including what to have for meals, which produced a degree of interspecies conflict that the legal working groups had not anticipated, and which Issa Noth's tonal translation context rendered, with great precision, as productive chaos. On the final day, the charter was signed by 14 species and 12 independent worlds and 1 ambassador from Earth, who sat in a circle seat like everyone else, and added her name in the same size text as every other name on the document. Marin Vash, attending as a private citizen under Article 7 provisional status, sat in the back row and watched. She had read all 47 pages. She had come back with 21 questions. We had answered all of them over 3 evenings in the Geology Conference Hotel. On the night before the summit, she had told me, very quietly, that she had resigned her council seat that morning. She had not told her government in advance. I recognized the approach. On the last evening of the summit, after thus signing on and the formal session photographs and the interminable process of translating 4 different species concepts of celebration into something that worked for all of them, simultaneously, I found Issa Noth standing at the wide viewport that looked out at the stars. She had a bowl of popcorn. She had brought it from Earth specifically. She had asked Paul to source the ingredients and had prepared it herself in the station kitchen, which had required 40 minutes of cross-species culinary instruction that Paul later described as the most diplomatically complex conversation he had ever witnessed. I stood beside her. "How does it feel?" she asked. I thought about that. "It feels like the beginning of something difficult," I said, "which is the only feeling worth having when you are starting something worth doing." She made a low tonal sound that the translation system rendered as accurate and unnecessary. I laughed. We stood at the viewport together, watching the ships come in. Compact ships with new transponder codes docking at a station that the Council's jurisdiction maps still described as undefined. A Ferenti shuttle, an Oru long-range vessel. A small unmarked craft that I recognized as belonging to a retired Kale diplomat who had been quietly invited to observe Day 4 of the summit and had not gone home afterward. Below us, in the circular chamber, Paul was helping 2 Ferenti legal staff dismantle the table arrangement so that the chairs could be reconfigured for the first working session of the Compact Standing Committee, which was scheduled for the following morning, and which had an agenda that was already 43 items long. Somewhere in a building on Vela Station, the Galactic Council was, as Gary had predicted, in committee. The committee had produced a preliminary report. The preliminary report had recommended forming a secondary working group. The secondary working group had not yet met. Somewhere in a drawer in my office, the Council's formal request for full membership was still sitting where I had put it on Day 3. I had not touched it since. I was not planning to touch it for a while. 63 years seemed like a reasonable review period. It would be wrong to say I did not feel anything about that. I felt a great deal. 63 years is a long time to carry something, and setting it down does not mean it becomes weightless immediately. It just means that your hands are finally free for something else. Issa Noth offered me the bowl. I took a handful of popcorn. It was unreasonably good. "The Council sent another communication this morning," she said. Not a question. She knew. The Oru knew most things eventually. "They requested observer status," I said. In the compact, she turned to look at me. The tonal context note was something the translation system had never produced before. It took a moment to render. The result was the specific amusement of seeing a pattern complete itself perfectly. "And," she said. "And," I said, "I am going to let it sit on my desk for a while." She turned back to the viewport. "How long?" I looked at the stars, at the ships, at the shape of something new that was already larger than what had produced it. 63 years, I said. Give or take. She made the sound again, the one the translation system called accurate and unnecessary. Outside the viewport, the ships kept coming in. There was work to do. Real work. The kind that does not end when the signing is done and the speeches are over. The kind that requires everyone in the room to keep showing up, keep arguing, keep revising, keep choosing the harder and more correct answer over the easier and convenient one. The kind of work that a committee cannot do, because a committee produces reports and a table produces decisions, and the difference between those two things is the difference between describing a door and walking through it. I finished the popcorn. I handed the empty bowl back to Issa Noth. She looked into it with this expression of someone who has decided they need more, but is willing to wait. I went to find Paul, and then I went to the working session, and then I went to sleep later than I should have. And the next morning, I was at my desk before the sun came up. Coffee at my right, the new morning briefing open on my screen. The briefing was longer than it used to be. The compact had 14 members and growing interests and more problems to solve than any single day could contain. Gary's notes were at the bottom, as always, neat and precise, and containing more between the lines than on them. The last line of his briefing read, "Good work, now keep going." I read it twice the way I always read things that matter. Then I picked up my coffee, and I kept going.